back, grade 10s. As you know, we have only 2 writing assignments in this stream. The second writing assignment, the one I call A2, has 2 steps to it. First, we analyze the source, and then we respond to it. So far, we've looked at some sample essays. We've compared some of the analyses that we've seen, and we've had a tutorial on how to analyze the source. Now this is the first source that you've been presented with that you've been asked to analyze. I want to see how far we've gotten as a group, and let's see if we can analyze some of this together. So, what might be the first step? We're going to use the blue marker for this. What's the first thing that we should do in terms of analyzing a source? What do we need to do? Yes?
Unpack the ideological perspective.
Yeah, so we're going to need to unpack an ideological perspective. That's definitely a key step here. That's the most important step. So we're going to try to unpack an ideological perspective, and we need to use that term ideological perspective in our analysis paragraph. What is the ideological perspective about? What do we use? What is that term that we use to describe what the ideological perspective is about? It's about what? You almost said it. The theme, right? So we're going to have a theme, and there's going to be an ideological perspective in response to that theme. What else do we know so far? That the ideological perspective is going to have what kind of connection with the theme? It's going to do this or that. What are the 2 options? Challenge or celebrate it. And how do we know if it challenges it or celebrates it? We need to look into the perspective, or look into the source, look at the language and unpack that and see if there's some clues. So, thinking logically here a little bit, what is the theme? The theme of this source, the theme of every source in Social 10 is what? Globalization. Globalization is about the interconnectedness of our species. Is there any language here that actually proves to us explicitly that this theme of globalization is embedded in this source? Is there any language, phrases that you could pull out and say, when it says this, it's talking about globalization? How do we know? Yes? Okay. So that's globalization. That's the theme. Anything else that is talking about the theme of globalization? The static nature of all cornerstones has proved to be fatal. I think better language would be like proven fatal. In order to survive and possibly transform, civilizations must be open to outside ideas. Anything else about globalization? Okay, well, we've shown that it's about globalization here. So we've identified the theme. Once we've identified the theme, then we might look at it and say, is it celebrating or is it challenging? The theme. If it's challenging it, then there's going to be an issue presented. If so, what's the issue? So in order to find whether or not it's celebrating the theme or challenging it, we need to look at the language here, look for the details, and see, is there an issue presented? Either explicitly, it's like, here's a problem, or they imply an issue implicitly. The static nature of Cornerstones has proven to be fatal. In order to survive and possibly transform, civilizations must be open to outside ideas. What's the issue? Yes? Yeah, so the issue here is cornerstones have proved to be fatal. That's an issue. So sometimes when we look at the issues, we can identify, okay, this is a challenge to globalization. We're challenging something here. There's a threat here, right? There's some kind of issue. Now, when we look at the issue, we can also say, what's their goal? So within issue, we're trying to say what issue is being presented. There's the issue. Is there a goal? Is there a goal in mind? What are they trying to accomplish? If we take away the issue, what might we be able to do? Yeah? You're close. This is the solution. This is the solution to the issue. But what's the ultimate goal? That if we do this, then what are we going to be able to do?
Survive and transform.
Yeah, survive and transform. This is the goal. So let's look at this again then. If the issue is cornerstones have proven to be fatal, what kind of cornerstones? Static ones. That's key language here. Cornerstones have proven to be fatal. If we want to survive, that's our goal, then our path to surviving is open to outside ideas. Let's go back and rethink this. Are we celebrating or are we challenging globalization? I thought your hand was up, sorry. You're like, oh, this hand's not up. Are we celebrating or challenging globalization?
We're celebrating it in the sense that if we participate in outside ideas, which is like interconnectedness, we'll be able to like evolve and transform and survive.
Yeah, so in order to figure out how we connect to the theme, we kind of looked into the source and we tried to break it through to like, what's the issue, what's the solution, what's the goal, and is globalization being shown as a solution or as a problem? Here it's being shown as a solution. So this source is celebrating globalization as a possible solution to overcome our issue, which is our static cornerstones. So far, we've identified the theme, globalization. We knew that because it talked about outside ideas. Then within the theme, we try to say, okay, are we celebrating that, globalization, or is that something that we're trying to challenge? Well, then we had to kind of pause for a second and say, well, let's look at this from another angle. Let's unpack it a little bit and say, is there an issue within the source? And the issue is our static cornerstones. Well, what's the solution? The solution is to be open to outside ideas. Because that's the solution, it's promoting globalization. It's celebrating it. It's pro-globalization. So we're going to unpack that with the perspective. Let's continue with the ideological perspective. Now that we've introduced it generally, let's see if we can talk about it in more detail. So we already know the ideological perspective celebrates globalization, offers it as a solution to our issues. So if we're going to use the red marker, then which phrase up there is key to the ideological perspective? The static nature of cornerstones is proved to be fatal. In order to survive and possibly transform, civilizations must be open to outside ideas. It's okay to be wrong. Yes? Yeah, here we go. Just do one of these. That's key to the ideological perspective. That is key to the ideological perspective. So you can see we've got green and blue and red, all of that key phrase at the bottom. We need to unpack this phrase, right? how do we unpack the ideological perspective? We can talk about key language, the static nature. So the ideological perspective is attacking static nature. So in our unpacking of what's on the page, we're going to need to identify key language. What does this mean? Static. And why is it being presented as a challenge, as a threat, as an obstacle? So what does it mean to be a static character in literature? Yes?
Don't change.
You don't change. So the unchanging nature of Cornerstones, right? The unchanging. The unchanging nature of Cornerstones. Next key word here might be, well, what's a cornerstone? Can't really unpack this essay without understanding cornerstones. Well, it's not just any cornerstones. It's cornerstones of what? What are these cornerstones of? Heard it back here. If you read it through and you combine it, cornerstones of, the static nature of cornerstones has proved to be fatal. Proven fatal would be better language. In order to survive and possibly transform, civilizations must be open to outside ideas. What kind of cornerstones are those?
Like cornerstones of civilization.
Absolutely they are. These are cornerstones of civilizations, meaning what, right? So we have to say, what are the cornerstones of civilization? Well, in my 10-2 class right now, they have an assignment that they're working on where they're creating a hypothetical, a fictional civilization. And they have to build it cornerstone by cornerstone. We have to say, what are the social cornerstones? What are the economic cornerstones? What are the political cornerstones? What are the religious cornerstones, the legal cornerstones? What are the military cornerstones? Maybe there's some foreign policy cornerstones. Maybe there's some collective identity cornerstones. So in architecture, the cornerstone, that's that first piece that you lay first, and then you build everything related to it. And if that first cornerstone is flawed, then the structure is flawed. It's condemned to collapse. It's doomed. So this source is saying that the cornerstones are flawed because they're unchanging. Because you build a civilization, a city-state, an empire on some founding principles, but because those founding principles are static, they don't change, eventually the civilization collapses. So when we look at ancient civilizations, we'll look at ancient civilizations that have collapsed. We look at the religious cornerstone within Egypt. We'll look at the political cornerstone in ancient Athens. We'll look at the social cornerstones in places like Sparta, including the role of military, the gender roles within ancient Sparta. And as we look at those civilizations next week, you're planning your essay. You're understanding the source. So I'm giving you the source before I give you the content, so that as we learn the content, you can see some relevance. I need you thinking about this essay as we're learning the content. So that's what Cornerstones is. Any other keywords? The static nature of Cornerstones has proven to be fatal. Anything else? Yes?
Fatal.
Fatal. There's a tone attached to this. What kind of tone is attached to that? Well, simply put, you could say a fatalistic tone. But, there is a sense of doom, pessimism. It's alarmist. That the inclusion of the word fatal announces the significance of the source. If left unaddressed, how bad will it get? Civilizations will die. So how do we know that? How do we know the significance of the source? You have to look at the evidence, the details, what's on the page. You look at what's on the page to figure out why it's there. We look at this word and we figure out the significance. So when we break down these sources, we break down the language. Much like we did with the word survive. That's the goal, in order to survive. Now, another step that we could look at is the division of society. And when we look at the division of society, so step 4 might be the significance, and we already identified the word fatal, right? And then step 5 might be this idea of, does everybody agree? The division of society. And within the division of society, we have proponents and opponents. People who agree with the source and would further it. And opponents are people who would disagree with the source and attack it. So, let's look at the proponents for a second. Is there any possible evidence that one could inject to further the perspective that is presented here? The evidence could be theoretical, the evidence could be historical, could be contemporary, could be hypothetical. That's what proponents might do. Proponents might inject some evidence to further the perspective presented. So as we learn this content in the next couple of days, we want to look at, well, who would agree with this source? Who would agree that the static nature of Cornerstones has proven fatal, and in order to survive and possibly transform, civilization must be open to outside ideas? Who might be a proponent of that, and who might be an opponent? And when we unpack the proponents, what values are they promoting? What beliefs are they expressing? What vision of the world do they have? But not everybody agrees. That's why it's a complicated issue. We're going to have some opponents. And when we look at the opponents, they're probably going to look at the above groups of values and beliefs and vision and say, well, you've made some assumptions that might be flawed. What are the flawed assumptions that are being made by the proponents? What is the bias, the limitation of the perspective in the proponents? And if you accomplish these steps, you've analyzed the source. And that's the first step of an essay. There's no magic order it has to happen in. We don't mark it and say, well, sorry, she talked about significance before she talked about the division of society, so she loses a mark. It doesn't have to happen in a prescribed order, but some steps do make sense to happen before others. But in the end, what are we looking for? A discussion about the theme being presented. Globalization in this year. We want you to identify, is it celebrating it, or is it challenging it, and how do we know? So you're going to have to look at the language to find that. You might have to look and say, is there an issue here? Is there a solution? What's the goal? That's another step. Ultimately, the big thing we're talking about is an ideological perspective here. What is the ideological perspective of the source? Well, ideological perspective about what? About the theme, about the issue, about the solution. With regard to that ideological perspective, you're going to have some proponents that further the perspective and say, hey, we agree, and this is why. These are their shared values and beliefs and vision. But you'll also naturally, in a divided society, have some opponents and say, you know what, we don't agree. There's a kind of a flaw to this argument. And ultimately, what's the significance if we don't address this? So, an example of the voice of opposition. An example of the voice of opposition, to go back to the key language part, might be, in order to survive. Critics would say, who's defining what survival looks like? The static nature of Cornerstones has proven to be fatal. In order to survive, civilizations must be open to outside ideas. So if Hitler's trying to orchestrate his civilization, his vision of what survival looks like, and the role of citizens in government that will lead to or result in that survival, it's going to be different than, say, John Locke would say, somebody who values democracy. Or different than, say, a democratically elected leader like Joe Biden might say. So we can look at the significance of the language and say, well, depending upon how we define survive, we might have a division of society. Possibly transform. Well, Hitler was trying to transform his society, but in which direction? He's trying to transform his society in a reactionary direction to recreate a glorious past that he thought the Germanic people once had. Mussolini was trying to recapture the glory of Rome. Not everybody saw that as a positive transformation. So in order to unpack the division of society, we can further the importance of language. Civilizations must be open to outside ideas. Opponents of that. Not everyone wants to be open to outside ideas. In the global village today, we do have some countries practicing isolationism as much as they can. North Korea, not open to outside ideas. Therefore, the North Korean regime is an example of a nation built reflecting values opposite of what is being shown as the path to survival here. I think of current events today. Ukraine's been invaded by Russia. This source is saying in order to survive and possibly transform, the Ukraine must be open. You could argue that had the nation of Ukraine been more closed, it would have been less vulnerable to attack. You know, if they had closed borders. Or you could also say, well, no, that's completely wrong. You could say, no, had they been more open to NATO years ago and been a part of the club by now, then NATO would be defending Ukraine today. Not every 18 to 60-year-old male with guns that they've been left in the streets by their nation to rally to the cause. So you can see how it's very complicated. The way you look at words like open to outside ideas can change your perspective about whether or not the solution being offered here is the correct one. So what you're going to want to do over the weekend, you have a long weekend, piece together an analysis here. It might be a draft number one, it might not be your final draft, but piece together an analysis so that we can begin to consider how would we respond to this. Because after we do an analysis, the last section of your analysis of source, usually just a sentence, that's your thesis, and that's your response. You can't respond to it before you understand what you're responding to. So you're going to want to finish up some analysis, and then we can talk about thesis statements next week. Any questions? We have 15 minutes left. Let's tidy up your analysis. Now you can work with others. At first I wanted to see if you understood the assignment on your own. Because if you didn't, then you have some homework to do.